Okay, we are recording. I am happy to welcome my friends to our virtual weekly Lunch and Learn. My name is Holly Dinnany. I am with Family Partners of Morris and Sussex County, and I am welcoming my friends to our virtual Lunch with an Expert. As you know, we've been holding these programs weekly ever since the beginning of the pandemic. 2 months ago, we started having one a month in Espanol, which we're very excited about, which is off to a strong start as well. But I would like to first cover a couple housekeeping items for you. We are happy to have you here. We encourage you to leave yourself muted unless you're speaking. We also encourage you to use the chat function. If you have a question, if you have a comment, it helps us if everyone's muted just to minimize background noise. But if you have something you'd like to say or a question, I will be watching the chat. So feel free to interject. And our guest today, Ben Davey, has said he's okay with questions coming as he's talking. So feel free to use the chat function. We're happy you're here. We also know that this is lunch hour for many of you. And while we love to see smiling faces, Andrea, I see yours, and I'm going to wave. We are also okay if you want to leave the camera off because you're nibbling or doing something else. We're just happy to have you here. This is a casual format for lunch with an expert to learn something about something that is will be helpful to you in your role in supporting a youth with challenges and families who love them. So today's Lunch and Learn, today is Thursday, August 27th, 2020. And our guest today is Benjamin Davey, who is a resource development specialist with the Division of Child Protection and Permanency. So Ben, we were laughing before this started about your agency has had many names over the years, frequently changing, formerly DIFUS, but today we are with Division of Child Protection and Permanency.
DCP,
so,
yes.
That's right. So, Ben has agreed to come and talk to us about, just the referral process, how the system works, what the impact has been of the pandemic, and maybe he'll do a little myth busting as far as what some of us might think to be true as far as the agency's reaction to things like physical discipline and leaving your child alone and what have you. So before we get started, because we're having lunch with my friend Ben. Ben, I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit about Benny's Bodega, which I understand is something that you are very involved with. It sounds like a really great organization.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, Holly. I love being here and I love talking about, I know it's a weird topic, but I do love talking about child protection. But before, Benny's Bodega is a local nonprofit. It was started by myself and my family and a couple other volunteers. And what it is it's just a nonprofit to help families meet their basic needs. So if you know of a family that's struggling with food, clothing, cleaning supplies, especially now, hygiene supplies, that sort of thing, you can refer them over to us and we just make sure that they have the ability to have all their basic needs met so then they can focus on, more concerning problems, other issues that they got going on. So it's just, it's a startup. We're only a year and a half into operation. We've grown quite a bit in the past year and a half. We have a physical location over in Andover, 5 Lenape Road. It's the old A&P for those familiar with the area. We're open Tuesdays and Wednesdays from 10 to 3 and Saturday 9 to 12. So just 3 days a week at the moment. We operate all on volunteers. It's all community based. So community members donate and then it's our responsibility to get the stuff back out to the families that need it. So that's just the long story, the long short of it. And we hope to do good things. We hope to be around for a long time. We have a passion about it. We hope to grow. We have some ideas, some cultural things we hope to do. So just look for us, support us, and we hope to be around in the community for a while.
That's terrific. And just for our participants today, a reminder that we will be sharing this video following Ben's presentation, but we also will be sending out some materials on DCP&P, but also, Ben, if you could include a little bit of information on the bodega, that might be helpful too if people want to either volunteer or donate or perhaps take advantage of the good charity that you've got going on there. That would be terrific, okay?
You got it. Yeah, the more awareness and the more we can spread the message and the information about the bodega, the better. So you got it, absolutely.
That's fantastic. Okay, so with no further ado, Ben is we're going to be an informal chat here about things that we need to know and things that will be helpful. And once again, I'm just going to remind you to please utilize the chat if you have a question as we're going on, or if you have a burning issue that you want to make sure that Ben addresses. He's here for us today. He's here to answer our questions and to help us understand the process. So Ben, I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks, Holly. And yeah, just like Holly said, I am very casual. I am very easy. If you guys have a question, feel free to interrupt. Feel free to chat it. It doesn't matter to me. The real goal of this is just to get as much information, factual information about DCP&P to you guys as we can. So as Holly was saying, yes, we undertook a name change a couple years ago. We're more commonly known as DIFAS, Division of Youth and Family Services. But we did change our name, and that was in an effort to get away from some of the negative connotation that was associated with DIFAS. So now we are DCP&P. We are Division of Child Protection and Permanency. And that is a statewide thing. That's the name of every DIFAS office in the state. And every county has a DCP&P office. The bigger counties have several DCP&P offices. In Sussex County, we have the one located right in Newton. As Holly mentioned, my role in the office is resource development specialist. And that really that's just a fancy name of saying community liaison. It's my job to just be the support in the community for the office, for the people that are working and seeing our families. So if there's ever an issue or a concern or a problem that you have with something, or you have a question and you don't have a name or someone else to contact, I'm your person. I'll make sure that I give out my contact information when we send out this presentation. But again, any questions, concerns, issues about, families or practices going on within the office, I'm your man to call and talk to, and hopefully we can figure it out. So with that said, mandated reporting, right? Little known fact, but in the state of New Jersey, all of us citizens and residents are actually mandated reporters. And really what that means is that if you have a suspicion that a child is being abused or neglected, you're obligated by law to call in to the hotline and make that report of information. Now I say hotline, in New Jersey, all our calls are funneled into one central location. It's called central screening or central registry. In DCP&P world, we refer to it as SCR. It is a physical building located down in Trenton that houses all of our social workers who literally take calls all day long. They operate on a shift basis. So every shift you have new social workers coming in, but it's their responsibility to field all the calls that are coming in statewide. If you do make a call, there's some things that you should know. And this is important information. When you do make a call, you are protected. You are, by law, protected confidentiality, meaning that anything that you report, your name, your information, anything is protected by law, meaning it is confidential. A social worker, a DCP&P investigator, no one, by law again, is allowed to divulge that information to anybody who's asking. A lot of times, the first question that investigators get when they're knocking on someone's door is, who called, right? We're not allowed, we are obligated and binded by law to keep that information confidential. I would say that a good majority of our families ask, and a lot of them are able to piece two and two together or feel that they can piece two and two together on who made the call based on some of the information that was reported. So we're obligated to keep that information confidential, but on the flip side of that, we're obligated to address the information that was reported. And then sometimes when you address the information that was reported, families have the ability to piece who made the call. So that's important. The other thing to note is that people who make calls are protected by law from any civil or criminal prosecution. So if you make a call and it happens to be erroneous or false, there's no repercussions for you. There's no one coming knocking on your door. You're protected by law. So that's important to note. New Jersey wants you to feel safe and secure in making that call to the hotline. So not only is the information protected, your identity is protected, and there's no penalty for making that call. New Jersey is one of the few states that has that in place, and I think that's important because I think it's important that people who have concerns feel comfortable enough to make that call. And when I say make that call, it's a 1-877 NJ abuse number. It's pretty easy to remember. It's just one number, and again, all those calls get funneled into one location, SCR, down in Trenton, where a social worker is going to pick up the phone. They're going to identify themselves, and then they're going to ask you to report the information that you have to report. Now, in doing so, they're also going to ask you a bunch of mandatory questions. You may or may not have the answer to those questions, and that's okay. You're not obligated to provide information to those questions. You don't have to have answers to those questions, but just understand that our social workers are obligated to ask those questions. And some of those questions might be in reference to any information about human trafficking, any information about violence in the home, any information about nowadays the family having any interactions with people who have tested positive for COVID. So there's going to be a litany of questions that are asked. And again, if you don't know the answer to those questions, you just simply say, I don't know or no. And the social worker is going to document your response and information in a report. And then at the conclusion of that report, after you have the opportunity to report your information, and after the social worker has the opportunity to document and answer and ask you the questions that they need to ask you, they're probably going to put you on hold. And when you're on hold, that social worker is going to go back and they're going to speak to a supervisor, and they're going to conference that case or that information with a supervisor. From there, a decision is made. Now, it's important that that you understand that the decision is made is the following. If you hear the words a CPS, that refers to an allegation of abuse and neglect. Now, CPS referrals get responded to in two time frames. They get responded to in 24 hours, and they get responded to in an immediate time frame. 24 hours simply indicates that an investigator will respond to the family home or to a school, etc., within 24 hours. They will make contact with that family or the child victims within 24 hours of the receipt of that referral. An immediate response simply means that an investigator will respond by the end of business or the end of closing hours that day. After hours, it's within a couple hours of receipt of the referral. So if you're making a call during a 9 to 5 hours and the social worker puts you on hold and comes back and says that's a CPS immediate, you know now that a division investigator is going to respond to the family home and meet with the child victims by the close of business that day. If you get put on hold and the social worker comes back and says it's a CPS 24, you know now that an investigator is going to be making contact with the child victims within 24 hours of the receipt of that referral. Now, the other outcome of a referral is a CWS referral. Now, there's a distinct difference between a CPS referral, which again is an allegation of abuse and neglect, and a CWS referral, which is not an allegation of abuse and neglect, more what we refer to as a child welfare assessment. This is more of an assessment of the family to see if the family can benefit from community intervention or from services that the division has contracts with. Now, a lot of times, a CPS, I should say the majority of the times, a CPS or a CWS referral is going to be responded to within 72 hours. There are circumstances, however, where a CWS referral will get responded to in an immediate fashion. Some of those examples will be a child who has behavioral issues, child sex on sex allegations where a child is being alleged to have done something sexual to another child. A lot of times that's a CWS immediate. There are certain guidelines that each social worker abides by down in SCR that they follow. So any information that is reported to a social worker down in SCR, down in central screening, they conference with the supervisor, and they're taking that information and they're utilizing a set of guidelines to put that information into categories. That's the simplest way to, without confusing you guys, without going into the long, detailed version of it, that's the simple way of explaining what happens to when you make a call. I see a question, so I'm gonna read it. Why are children put back in neglectful, abuseful homes? I've had personal experience with CPC where I thought their judgment was extremely off. People complain about this quite often. And Lindsay, that is a great question. And a lot of time, that is a question that we as investigators, as workers, we get all the time. And the best way that I can explain it is this, is that a lot of times we get information. The information may be concerning to us on a human and on a personal level. But DCP&P investigators don't investigate allegations of abuse and neglect based on their personal views. As a matter of fact, we're educated not to bring our biases and our views to the home. What that means is that we're taking this information and we're addressing it with the family, right? And we're leaving our biases and we're leaving everything at home. So we go there with information and we engage the family and we talk to the family. We have to go by what that family is reporting to us, okay? And in doing so, a lot of times that information is not exactly the information that was reported to us. Meaning that most times, right, when we're knocking on a family's door, families are not gonna just, admittedly say, yes, I hit my son, or yes, I happen to be using heroin and I just used, 4 hours ago and I'm under the influence right now. That's not typically how it goes. So typically what you get is a lot of denial. You get a lot of defensiveness. You get a lot of, no, that wasn't me. They're false allegations. Somebody's mad at me and they're calling this in. And it's our job to kind of decipher to what's truthful and what's not. Now, with that said, we may go into a home and we may not believe what is being reported to us, or we may have concerns. Unless we have documentation to support our concerns, our hands are really tied. Meaning that, and I'll give you an example. If there's a report that somebody's misusing drugs, smoking marijuana, using heroin, cocaine, that sort of thing, and we go out to the home and there's nobody under the influence, and mom and dad or grandma, whomever are saying, no, that's not true, that's not true. And then they say, we'll come in and we'll do a substance abuse evaluation for you to prove that they're not true, prove that those allegations are not true. Then they come in, they do the evaluation, we reach out to police, we reach out, and I'll talk about that in a second because that's an important part of our investigation, but we obtain the information that we need to do, and there's nothing in the information that confirms that this family is misusing substances. So if they're denying it and there's nothing that can confirm that they're using substances, there's really nothing that we can do. So a lot of times what happens is that the division operates a lot like the police. We can't really do a lot until something bad happens, unfortunately. Now, sometimes we can be preventative, but a lot of times we don't get involved in a family's life, or we don't intervene until something happens, something documented happens that proves that there's an abuseful and neglectful situation going on. I hope that makes sense. And please, if you have any other follow-up questions, please feel free to ask.
And I was just going to say too, though, it seems to me that it's helpful. I would think there's still something good coming out of the call, even if you aren't able to act on it, because then the family is aware that others are aware of what might be happening.
Yes, which is a great point, Holly, and thank you for bringing that up. Yes, so a lot of times the call, we don't necessarily have to intervene and open up a case, and I'll explain that later, in order to be impactful. A lot of times, just when we're knocking on the door, the reason why they get defensive, right, is there's a feeling attached to that, right? So they're upset, they're worried, they have anxiety, they're fearful because they don't know what's going to happen, right? So, they get defensive, right? But yeah, a lot of times just our presence on the door can be impactful and changing what can be, an inappropriate or just a bad situation. So that's a great point. But with that said, if our presence doesn't do it, and unless we can find an unmet service need or an instance where a child is being abused or neglectful, a lot of times there's not a lot of things that we can do. And that leads me into our next thing, because I want to explain the difference between an investigation, an open investigation, and an open case. So we talked about people contacting the hotline. Now, a DCP&P investigator cannot and will not go to anybody's home unless the allegation is reported to SCR. The allegation being reported to SCR, the social workers down in Trenton, is what initiates a DCP&P investigator to respond to a home. Okay, so when that allegation comes in and the town is in Sussex, Newton office will get that report, and then it will be assigned to an investigator. Okay, from that day, let's just say today's August 27th. Let's just say you call in today, the social worker does everything that we talked about before, and it gets sent up to Newton and it's assigned to an investigator on August 27th. From August 27th, that investigator has 60 days to complete that investigation. And during that 60-day investigation time frame, we're doing a bunch of different things. We're responding to the child victims first. So we're speaking to kids first. We're going and we're doing that investigation or that interview unannounced. We do not notify parents that we're coming. We ask schools and other entities that call us that they do not notify the parents that we're coming. And we do that for obvious reasons. So our investigation, so our information is not tainted, right? A lot of times, if as a parent, we know DCP&P is coming to the house, we might say, hey, what happens in the house stays in the house. Or, you know, mommy did this or daddy did this. I don't want you talking about that with other people, right? So we're trying to avoid that being tainted, that interview being tainted. We want to get as much honest and honest information as we can from that child, because that's important. That's our first and most valuable source of information. So we're responding unannounced to child victims first. We're speaking to the non-offending parent next, and then we're speaking to the alleged perpetrator, okay? So anybody who lives in that house is going to be seen or interviewed by the DCP&P investigator. Now, that's in a perfect world, right? We get to the house and everybody's there and everybody's willing to speak to us and everybody has something to say. Now, we all know that we don't live in a perfect world, and sometimes people don't really care for us being in their home or being in their lives. So they may excuse themselves, politely, of course, right, from being interviewed with us, or they may just say, I don't want to be interviewed, or they may just give us very little information. So in a perfect world, we're asking everybody to sit down and have a conversation with us. But again, it's not a perfect world, and that does not happen all the time. So after we speak with everybody and we address the allegations, we ask the legal caregivers, whether that's mom or dad or the grandparents, to sign releases. And New Jersey law or legislation obligates every investigator to obtain collateral information on each child. And what that means is that the DCP&P investigator is going to sign a release and ask the parent for permission to contact their school and their family's pediatrician. And what that does is that gives the DCP&P investigator a global view of what's going on in that home. On top of that collateral information from each child's school and from each child's doctor, and most of the time it's one doctor, right? We're asking parents to sign releases for police departments, if required, to obtain, to see if there's any police involvement, if the police have been out to the home, and if they've been out to the home, what they've been out there for. We're also asking if adults and/or kids have any involvement with mental health professionals. We're also going to ask them to sign a release so we can make contact with them. And again, it's not punitive at all. It's to give us a global view and to obtain as much information as we can on this family, so we as an agency, as an investigator, can make the best assessment going forward for your family. Because at the end of the day, the DCP&P investigator's #1 job is to keep children safe and to make sure children are safe. And we do that by going unannounced to complete interviews of children, by speaking to everybody in the house, by obtaining collateral information, by speaking with mental health professionals, by speaking with everybody who's in that house, and by obtaining police reports. Again, it gives us a global view of what's going on, and it allows the investigator to make an accurate assessment as to whether or not that allegation of abuse or neglect is going to be substantiated or established. I hope that makes sense. And please, if you have any questions, shout them.
I'm going to ask for clarification if I can, Ben. Does this happen with every allegation, or does it only happen if you see something that is concerning to you going into the home?
No, that's a great question. And that investigation process is for every single investigation, whether it is a CPS allegation or a CWS. Now, a CWS might be less intensive, right? There is no allegation of abuse and neglect, so we're not assessing safety. We're assessing service needs at that point. Excuse me. So our involvement is a little less intense. You know, you don't have, the CWSs don't come with the defensive-ness of the family, because, you know, we can do it announced. We can call a family ahead of time on a CWS. It's less, what's the word? It's just less intense because there's no allegation and there's no issues of child safety. It's more or less an assessment to see if we can help.
Right. So, and I'm gonna ask you this because I think I hear what you're saying, but that kind of sounds like in a perfect world once again, because I think sometimes people who need assistance might either be too proud, sure, or might be, I'm sure there are cultural differences about, sure, someone offering help or kind of getting in your business. So is that something that you struggle with as well? Because I really didn't realize that you had a kind of like an arm of what you do that is really just trying to connect them to resources. I mean, that makes 100% sense, but I would imagine that sometimes it's received differently by someone who's being visited by you.
And it's important. That's why we do these lunch and learns. And that's why I'm out there in the community to try to get that message out. And DCP in 2020, it looks a lot different. Child protection, I should say, in 2020 looks a lot different than it did even when I started, 13 years ago. It is not punitive. It is not, the agency's not trying to come after anybody. The agency wants to make sure that kids are safe and that families have what they need going forward to be safe and to be successful in parenting their kids.
And Ben, that's a different message, because you mentioned the DIFUS, and correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't it used to be that the focus was more on removing children from bad situations where, I mean, is that kind of what you're referring to as the bad vibe? Or if we can talk about that just for a minute, because it sounds like you've taken a very big change in what your thrust is, right? For the better.
I think, you know better, you do better. And I think, and we have a lot more information on our hands. We have a lot more information about childhood trauma and the impact and the lifelong impact it has on people. And I think as an agency, we're developing and we're educating and we're just becoming more proficient at what we're doing. So yeah, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it was a lot different. We may come into a house, an unsafe house, and we may just remove kids and ask questions later. Nowadays in 2020, I can guarantee you that the only way a child is being removed or the division is intervening in custody or any sort of matter like that is if a child is unsafe. And that is really the message that the agency wants to get out. We do not, as an agency and as a state, we do not want to remove kids. We do not want to interfere with people's custody and interfere with people's rights, but we're obligated as an agency to make kids safe. And a kid is deemed unsafe when what is going on in the house does not fit the criteria set forth by the state. And that's what's important. It's not my personal views of safe and unsafe. It's what the state has set forth in its guidelines that I have to follow that determines whether or not this child is safe or unsafe. And I hope that makes sense. But the real message in 2020 is we're engaging. We have access to a lot more services than we did years ago. We're more family oriented than we were years ago. And we want to have successful outcomes. We do not want to see families back again and again and again. In fact, the recidivism rate in Sussex County is one that is higher than the state average. And it's something that we're working on as part of our improvement plan as an agency and as an office. But the message is we don't want to see families back. We want to see families. If we need to see you, we want to see you once, and we want to work with you, identify what you need going forward to be successful, and call it a day, really.
And Ben, we have a question. Someone's asking where we can find the guidelines as far as what the state's guidelines for safety, as far as, I don't know if there's a matrix or.
Yeah, if you go to the state's website, you will find it. If you Google it, you will find it. If you search the state website, you will find it. And in addition to that, if you have difficulty finding it, what I'll do is I will get a copy and I will attach it to this presentation, as long as I'm permitted to by my boss, and I'll just check with her beforehand. But as long as I'm permitted to, I will attach it to the presentation, and you guys will have, and anybody will have access to it. I'm almost positive, though, it's on the state's website, and it's accessible to the public.
Great, thank you.
So our investigation period, again, is 60 days. Now, the important part of this message is this, right? We have 60 days. Now, speaking on average and in generalities, right? The Sussex office, in and of itself, on average, gets about anywhere from 90 to 110 referrals a month. That is just the small office of Sussex County. And what I mean referrals is that is 90 to 110 allegations going into SCR, where a social worker is, like I talked about, doing that process, making referral and sending it up to an office. So that means anywhere from 90 to 110 referrals are getting assigned to our 15 to 17 investigators that we have in the office. Okay. So it's
how often is that? I'm sorry, Ben. That number is for how often?
So
A
we
month?
get on average about 90 to 110, given, every month is different.
A month, but a month.
A
Those are
month,
the
but a
numbers are for
month,
the month.
right? And
Okay.
and
Wow.
on a given, and in an office, we have anywhere from 15 to 17 investigators. Now that number varies on leaves, people having children, various other life circumstances that arise. So sometimes we have less, sometimes that we have more. Each investigator, because of the federal government, has a cap on a number of investigations that they can get per month. So investigators aren't overwhelmed in terms of the number of investigations that they're investigating per month. Years back, you hear horror stories of social workers being overwhelmed. That's not the case anymore. It is capped, it is monitored, and there's supports in place for workers. So they'll get assigned the investigation, they'll go out, they'll do what we had talked about, meet with everybody, get releases. And the one thing I did want to mention at releases is if the parent does have the right to say, you know what, I do not want to sign those releases. You have that right to decline signing the releases. But it's important to note that New Jersey legislation or New Jersey law indicates that a DCP&P investigator is obligated to obtain that information regardless of whether or not you give permission. So we ask that you sign releases because we want to be in the process with you. We want you to be voluntary participants. But it's important to know that we do not need your signature to obtain that information. And that's just information on your children. We do need your signature to obtain information on you personally. I hope that makes sense. So getting back to the investigation process, we come out, we get our information, we assess what's going on. Remember going back to the 90 to 110 a month. I'm going to use 100 because I'm terrible at math and it's just a nice, easy round number. So on average, I would say anywhere from 90 of those cases, so 90% of those cases are going to be closed out at the intake level. Now, every month is different. We could have months where we close out 95%, or we could have months where we close out 80%. And what that means is that we're terminating our involvement as an agency. The investigation period is over. We determine this outcome as part of the investigation, and then we're closing our case because the situation in the house does not fit the state's criteria of abuse and neglect, and there are no unmet service needs. So we close that out. The family gets a letter in the mail, and then our involvement is over. And we do not go back out to that family unless someone contacts the hotline again, which initiates another investigation. I hope that makes sense. In the event that we go to the home and we assess and that there's real concerns going on, somebody had just overdosed, there's bruises on a child, whatever the case may be, we assess that there's a concern of abuse or neglect. Now that is distinctly different than if there's no concern of abuse and neglect. Because remember, we just said that no concern of abuse and neglect is going to mean that your case is going to get closed. If you have a concern, if there's an identified concern of abuse and neglect, your case is going to get transferred to a permanency worker, and you now have an open case instead of an active investigation. Does that make sense? And I get a question here. Can you tell us those guidelines, please, or is there someone we can find now? Oh, kind of answered that. The guidelines for what, Lindsay?
You answered that, I think. I think you answered that. That's why I asked you the question.
Oh, okay.
It was answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. So there's a distinct difference than having an active investigation. So anybody, you, me, anybody with kids can have an active investigation, because all an active investigation means is that somebody picked up the phone, right, and made an allegation to the social workers down in SCR in Trenton, right? That's all that means. And that means that the information that they reported to the social worker down in Trenton fit the criteria as set forth by New Jersey. And because it fit the criteria, New Jersey coded it and an allegation of abuse and neglect, which, as we talked about, means an investigator is going to come to the house. Now, anybody can call on anybody in the state of New Jersey, right? You can be anonymous. We had talked about your identity is confidential, right? So you can imagine what happens from time to time when people have disputes with other people, especially divorced people or people who are going through separations. and they feel like they can get an upper hand on their spouse or their ex-spouse by contacting the division. It happens a lot. It's wrong, yes, and it's a misuse of the system, but it happens a lot. What I'm getting at is those types of situations, you have a closed case. The concerning situations, it's an active case to an open case, okay? Now, an open case means, again, that your case is going to be internally transferred from a DCP&P investigator to a permanency worker. Now, that permanency worker's job is to meet with that family monthly or twice a month, depending on the risk deemed by the agency. And it's going to be that person's job to link that family to services to mitigate the identified concerns. For an example, if there's a concern that somebody's misusing substances in the home, and I'm going to use heroin because that is the most typical substance that we run into, okay? So if it's alleged that Mrs. Smith is using heroin, and we have confirmation that she overdosed a week ago, and we have an identified concern, we transfer that case. We would ask Mrs. Smith to come and complete a substance abuse evaluation, and I'll talk about that in a minute, through our office. Now, she completes the evaluation, and now she has treatment, a treatment recommendation. That permanency worker's job is to make sure that Mrs. Smith follows up with that treatment recommendation. And by following up with that treatment recommendation, Mrs. Smith is mitigating the identified concerns of substance use by the division. Does that make sense? So she's taking the concern that we said, Mrs. Smith, we have a concern that you're using heroin. It affects your ability to parent and supervise your children appropriately. And because we have this concern, let's talk about how we mitigate that. One way that we do that is we get you in treatment. And Mrs. Smith goes into treatment. She completes her treatment. Really, there's no problem. The problems that arise is when Mrs. Smith says, I don't have a problem and I'm not doing your treatment. Then we have a problem, because now an agency, remember, who is number one job is to make sure children are safe, have identified a concern that potentially makes a child unsafe. Now, as an agency, you can't let that concern go unchecked or unmitigated, right? So we work with that family, we engage that family to hopefully get that family, in this case, Mrs. Smith, into treatment. I hope that makes sense. In a perfect world, Mrs. Smith is going to say, oh my God, thank you, you're here. Yes, I have a problem. I don't want to be substance use and be involved in substance use anymore. I would love to help. She comes in, she does her treatment, she does everything that she needs to do. As an agency, our concerns are now mitigated or lessened, and we close out, never to see Mrs. Smith again, because she's on the road to recovery and she remains sober for the next 50 years of her life. Perfect world, best case scenario. I would love it if all of it happened like that, but it typically does not happen like that, right? A lot of times in recovery, there's relapse, right? A lot of times, and before somebody may be ready to be sober, there's some challenges that the worker and that the family has to work through. Another way that we mitigate some of the concerns, right? And I'm just using the substance use as an example because that's our most typical one. Another way we can mitigate some of those concerns is by, and this has been a real shift in the agency, and this is a real positive shift, is that we utilize positive family supports. So if we can get a grandma, an aunt, an uncle, a positive friend to be in that home, or we can get the children to reside in a family member's home while Mrs. Smith is working out her ability to be sober, all the better. We want families to identify positive supports. We want them to work with their identified supports, because again, remember, our number one goal is to keep kids safe, but to make a family have the positive supports and to have the things that they need to be successful in the future, because we do not want to see people again. We want to help mitigate the concerns, help with the concerns, build a support team, and hopefully kind of be on our way. That's just the long story version. That's the short version of what happens when there's an allegation. It's what happens internally when there is a concern identified. And then to the permanency worker. Now, just real quickly, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because again, it can get confusing. We have adoption workers. You know, if, like we talked about, if a case gets internally transferred to a permanency worker and a family is really not intent on working with us as an agency, and they don't really think that they have a concern, sometimes there's a period of time. It's ASFA. You could Google it. There's time frames in place. You know, families and kids have the right to permanency and have the right to have permanent homes. So we're working with families. We're working to keep families whole. But in an event that a child is deemed unsafe and we can't work with that family to keep that child safe, then yes, as an agency, we intervene and we remove that child from that home. It is something as an agency that we have the power to do. We don't, it is a last resort deal. We don't like to do it. It comes with a lot. Want to go into because it can get confusing, but in the event that a removal occurs and that family is not compliant with what we're asking them to do, then we're going to transfer the case to an adoption worker. As an agency, we're contracted with services, meaning the state of New Jersey pays agencies to work with families. We're contracted with agencies to complete both psychological and psychiatric evaluations. We're contracted with agencies to complete counseling, to help families who are struggling with violence, domestic violence in the home. We're contracted with Advocacy Center in Newton, Project Self-Sufficiency. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. So as an agency and as a state, we understand that if we identify a concern, we have to help a family mitigate that concern. So we do have services available to families that are where there is a concern of abuse or neglect. Now, the services I just identified are not typically going to be given, or there's not an opportunity for the families if there's just an active investigation. In order to access the services that I just identified, they're 99% of the time, you know, every situation is different, of course, but 99% of the time, there has to be an identified concern, or the family has to voluntarily say, I want services, and then they can have access to those services. I hope that makes sense. I don't want to go into great detail about what internally happens when a removal takes place. I can tell you that by law, when a child is removed from their legal guardians, the case is in front of a judge, a family court judge, within 48 hours, 2 days. I can tell you that each DCP&P office is represented by a Deputy Attorney General, a DAG, who essentially is the attorney for the office. They represent legally what the agency is allowed to do and what legally we're obligated to do. I can tell you when a removal takes place and it does go in front of the judge, mom and dad are afforded the ability to meet with a public defender. So you do have the ability to meet with an attorney. I can tell you that that at that point, a case is monitored from a family court judge, and that's who kind of initiates services from there. But again, I don't want to go down that road. I think the important thing to note is allegation gets called into the hotline, SCR, one central location. A social worker is going to ask you a bunch of questions. They're going to code that information and that allegation based on New Jersey's standards and guidelines that they've set forth. They're going to conference that case with the supervisor. They're going to send it to the appropriate office. It's going to get assigned to an investigator. The investigator is going to go to the house, meet with family, obtain the collateral information, and then make a determination as to whether or not, A, the child is safe, and B, there's a concern of abuse or neglect. Again, the majority of our cases get closed at the intake level, right, where there's just an active investigation closed. But some cases where there is a concern of abuse or neglect, or there is an unmet service need, those cases internally get transferred to a permanency worker whose job it is to meet with that family monthly, make sure the family is linked to the community and to the contracted agencies I identified before, and ultimately make sure that that family has what it needs to be successful going forward. Is there any questions about that? I know it can get confusing. It took a lot of us a long time to understand a lot of it too. So if it's confusing, please shout out some questions. If not, I'll just kind of go on some myths. Go ahead, Holly. It looks like you got something to say.
I was just, I was just going to say, and certainly people, folks, please put your questions if you have any. And I don't want to take up your time, but it just, I hope there's a whole bunch of Ben Davies in this system, because I'm very uplifted by your attitude as far as, I think people, like you said, the old image of ripping children from homes and being punitive is very, very different than the story you're laying out for us today, which I find incredibly uplifting and hopeful, because, at Family Partners, we do the same thing. We're looking to connect families better in the community and within their own families. So I hope there's a lot of you out there, is what I'm going to say.
Well,
I see a question coming through. With all the state cuts, how is this affecting CP&P?
So that is a great question. And thank you for asking that.
Have the answer?
Because actually one of my jobs as the resource development specialist is I sit on the contracted agencies I talk about. I sit on those contracts, right? It's my job to have good relationships with those agencies. And in doing so, we're a state agency, and I don't know how much of you guys pay attention to what's going on with the state and its revenue, but our state, for lack of a better word and lack of a better phrase, is really struggling with its revenue. We're broke. And because that the state is broke, and because a lot of our services come from the state's budget, the state is looking to cut its budget. Now, if a state agency is run by the state budget and that budget is looking to get cut, then it's reasonable and common sense would dictate that that state agency is going to lose services. So in answer to that question, we won't know officially until the Senate and the House pass the budget. But I can absolutely say that there are going to be cuts to our services, and that some of the services that we have available as we speak will not be available come October 1st, unfortunately. So it has a negative impact. The virus has had a negative impact. We shut down as a state, I think it was March 17th, March 18th. So that process that we talked about, that wasn't occurring from March 17th to July 6th. The state put together a special COVID response team. I was fortunate enough, I say fortunate enough because I was able to work, and a lot of us weren't able to work, but I was able to be a part of that team. And we had a team in the Sussex, Morris, Passaic area. There was about 20 to 25 of us, and we covered those 3 counties for that 4 or whatever plus month period. And we worked every day. And a lot of people don't know this because, we aren't frontline work, or we are frontline workers, but we're not nurses and doctors, and we're not saving lives per se. But we did get out there and work. And myself personally, I was in hospitals, I was in police departments in March and April and May when it was really bad, and all my coworkers were too. So if any of them ever see this, man, a big shout out to all of them. We don't get the love and the support that we deserve, to be 100% honest with you. We do as workers and as an agency, we do a lot of great things, and we don't get to shout out ourselves, right? Because a lot of what we do is confidential, and parents and people don't want to know that we're involved. But I can say to you that not even me speaking, but my coworkers, especially during COVID, did a lot of great things, and they went into a lot of unsafe circumstances to make sure the kids in our area were safe. And honestly, to me, they all should be applauded, and they all should be awarded with some kind of whatever. But that's not for me to say. That's for the governor and the powers that be to say. But if I was in power, there would be a special day for all of them and all those people involved, because they're really special people.
Well, I agree with you, Ben. And I think, probably many of the people on this call, because we're all in the same type of field, understand that these problems that you're called to go into the homes for only get worse in a time of crisis that we're in right now with the pandemic. So we'll give you all the love and all the shout outs you want, because you're worthy. You deserve it.
And give them out to the rest of the people.
Well, I'm telling you though, I bet, it's really, it's inspiring to see the changes in your organization towards positivity and towards, again, safety of the child, helping the family. Families need help. Families don't always know they need help, or that help's always available. So can't say enough about what you do, and you're feeling the love, but we would love to hear about some of the myths. That was another thing. So we've got 10 minutes left here. We got an awesome, by the way, you got an awesome from the crowd. Let's see here.
Sharon. Hey, Sharon.
Nice.
I got a lot of love for Sharon. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. Love it. It can't be enough love. That's terrific.
Absolutely. So I do want to take the last 10 minutes though, because there are some myths to what we do, right? And there are some some things that as a whole and as a community, we don't understand. And I'm just briefly go over them. So a lot of times you hear people say, how am I supposed to discipline my kid? I can't spank a kid and before DCP is at my door, knocking on my door. Actually, in the state of New Jersey, you are allowed legally to physically discipline your child. So you can spank your child without any repercussions. Now, with that said, a lot of people don't agree with the physical discipline approach. So if you're outwardly expressing that you use physical discipline, you may have somebody anonymously report to our agency that you're utilizing physical discipline. Now, yes, somebody may come out and address that with you, but like I said, there's nothing that says that you're precluded from physically disciplining your child. You're allowed to. It's a parental decision. Now, where it starts to become abusive is when there's marks, there's bruises, there's weapons involved. You can't spank a 1-year-old in his head, right? You can hit a 17-year-old maybe a little bit different and harder than you could a 2-year-old. So age and developmental status of a child comes into play when you're using physical discipline. So there are circumstances behind the use of physical discipline, but physical discipline in of itself to the appropriate age, utilizing it in an appropriate way is perfectly fine in the state of New Jersey. Now, with that said, you may get somebody like me knocking on your door saying, hey, why don't we use a more positive approach to discipline? And you may say, hey, go kick rocks because I have the ability to physically discipline my son. And then we can agree to disagree. We can shake hands and we can go on our way. Or we could fist pump in today's world. But you do have the ability to physically discipline your child. I mean, that's an important thing to know because there are people who believe in that approach. The other thing is supervision of your child. So there's no age that you turn where you automatically are allowed to be alone or to supervise other children. Every case, and I can tell you that every case is looked at on an individual basis. So if you may have a 7 or an 8-year-old who's extremely intelligent, who's extremely mature, who you feel comfortable leaving home for a couple minutes while you run to Benny's Bodega to grab some supplies, So, but on the flip side of that, you may have a 15-year-old who you don't trust and who gets into stuff and, has a propensity to get into things, who you may not want to leave home alone or who you may not want to supervise your siblings or your other children. So every situation in terms of supervision of a child when a child is allowed to be home alone is completely different. There is no age. Every situation is looked at a different level. And I can tell you that when an investigator goes out to the house, they're going to ask you about supervision. Does that child have any delays, developmentally delays? Does that child have anything that would impact his or her ability to call 911? Do they know 911? Do they have ability to utilize a phone? Or do they have access to a phone? Are you friends with the neighbors? So there's a million things that you can do, plans in place, where you can mitigate a lot of the concerns that go home with leaving your children home alone. And again, every situation is on an individual basis. Now, leaving your child in the car while you run into Benny's Bodega to drop something off, right? Or while you run into the supermarket to grab something or whatever the case may be. So you're always going to err on the side of caution, right? As somebody who, I have children and I understand how frustrating it can be to wake somebody up to go into Walmart or to whatever it is. But as somebody who works in the child protection field, I would tell you to be aggravated, be annoyed, and take your child into the store with you, whether they're sleeping or not. You're going to err on the side of caution. Now, if you make the decision to run into whatever store and you're in there for more than a couple minutes, you run the risk of police being called, somebody shattering your window, us coming and knocking on your door. I have personally responded to situations where a mom or a dad said that they were in the store for 1 or 2 minutes. And you got to remember, we live in 2020. Everything's on camera. You walk into that store, they have you on camera. Police are getting videotapes, so they know exactly how long you were gone. Everybody's response is, I was only gone 5 minutes or 2 or 3 minutes. And if that's the case, great. And if nothing happens, you're lucky. But in the likely event that you're in the store longer than that, you run the risk of potentially putting that child in an unsafe situation. Err on the side of caution, bring your child in with you, and don't jeopardize it. Now, again, if you do make the decision to run in and pick up a pizza and run back out, some things you might want to keep in your mind is make sure that you're in the line of sight of that child. Make sure you can always see your car. That's important. If your car has any safety features, it's important that they're activated, right? If it's 105 degrees, you know, you might want to leave your car running with the air conditioner on, with the doors locked, right? Again, activating safety features. You don't ever, under any circumstances, want to leave or knowingly leave a child in the car when it's hot. You know, that's just common sense. We all know how hot they get, how quickly they get. That's like a huge no-no, and that is a big problem if that happens. Most of the time, that's not an intentional act. That's just an unintentional lapse. Pools, make sure, you know, you have supervision when you're at parties. I personally responded to two separate calls this summer where in affluent neighborhoods where children were left, there was a lapse of supervision. And children, you know, something bad almost happened to two specific children. And thankfully, unfortunately, they weren't hurt, but it's just a quick lapse and it happens in really the instant. Always make sure that there's an adult by the pool. Always make sure that, you know, if a child is by the pool, there's someone watching. If you have the ability to hire a lifeguard or a kid, keep a kid in the pool so they can keep an eye on kids. The two instances that I responded to this summer, there were actually other people in the pool when this kid or this child almost drowned in the one instance. So this kid didn't make a sound. He just went under and nobody knew he was going under until dad rushed. And just long story short, just make sure that there's always supervision when you're at parties. You would be surprised how many moms and dads, good mom and dads say, I thought he, I thought she, I thought uncle, I thought aunt. And it happens in the blink of an eye. Those are some of the myths. We talked about physical discipline. And I just want to say a couple things too. So we have some things in the community. We have a lot of great services. I mentioned Project Self-Sufficiency. They are a wonderful agency right here in Newton. They work with just about every family. They have many different programs, from nursing programs to in-home programs to childcare. It is a great resource and a great service. If you're looking for support, they're probably the #1 option. Northwest Cap is in the community. They help out with utility bills. They have programs for employment, another great resource in the community. We partner with Ginny's House, which is the Child Advocacy Center. They do most of our sex abuse interviews. We're partnered with the prosecutor's office. Ginny's House is a nonprofit. They work on donations and they do receive some funding from the state, but a lot of their money and a lot of the services they offer are through donations. So if you're looking to support the community, those three, and on top of Benny's Bodega, they're all 4 great resources that are available to the community and the families we serve. And on top of that, and this is my last thing before I shut up, and I know you guys all want to go back to what you're doing, but a huge need. And we talked about removing children before. We don't want to do it, and it's a last resort. And Sussex County proudly has had their numbers of children in placement decrease over the years, and that's a great thing. But with that said, there is always a need for foster families and foster parents. It's a huge need. We have a great trainer. Sharon is our trainer. She does a phenomenal job training our foster parents. It's called Pride Training. So if you have any families that are willing and able to take on some of our kids in placement, they get trained by an awesome trainer. They're educated well. They're given all the tools that they need to be a support for this child. And it's a huge need, because when we do remove children, we do want to place them in loving, supportive homes. But we don't have a large amount of those homes. Every county, I think, is in need of these homes. So if you're willing and able to open your home, please reach out to the office. Elizabeth Nuss is our coordinator. You can reach out to Sharon Kelly. She's also in our office. She can help facilitate. It's a huge need. You'd be helping out. You wouldn't even understand the void you'd be fulfilling and the help you'd be providing to these kids. Because just when they come from an unfortunate, unsafe situation and they're going to somewhere that's loving, you would be surprised the change that you would see in these kids. So if you have anybody, or or yourself are willing and able to do it, please reach out to the office. You can call me, et cetera, and we'll make sure that you're linked up to the people that you need to be linked up to.
That's great. Ben, I have to tell you, I would not have imagined a DCP&P presentation to be like so inspiring and uplifting, but it really was, because it's really, it's terrific to better understand the process and what your goals are and how you work. And I see someone, Diane, typed in, thanks, Ben, for a very informative presentation and for always being an optimist and genuinely great human being. I think that's a really, really nice recap. And Sharon, if you don't mind unmuting, I saw you type something in the chat about God's closet or something. I just want to make sure that we know what that is.
Yes, actually it's God's beautiful closet. And I was just looking up the church. It is on 565 in Vernon. And one of our foster parents actually started it. I can't remember what the name of the church is right now. It's not coming up.
But they provide clothing. Is that what they do?
Yes.
Yes, they actually created a closet as well in their church. And they have a little changing room, and she gets donations and the church contributes to buy new clothes. And kids are brought with the workers to the closet and get to try on clothes and figure out which ones that they want. So I haven't actually spoken with her since we've been on shutdown. So I'm just assuming it's still running, but it is specifically for kids who are in our care.
Yes.
That's wonderful. I'm going to write that down. It's God's beautiful closet or God's amazing closet?
Yes. No, beautiful.
Closet. Yeah, it's
Beautiful
beautiful.
closet. And 565
in Vernon.
In Vernon. I'm going to look into that. If I'm able to get it, I will include that in the information that we send out to folks afterwards, because I really think we all have a responsibility to get the word out about a lot of people are doing some amazing things in our community to support our families. And we know that it takes a village. So thank you for sharing that, Sharon. And Ben, really, it's been a pleasure getting to know you at our little virtual lunch table today. Keep doing the good work that you're doing, and do feel the love, because you know what? Those of us who understand the ripple effect of the work that you're doing, you know, the immediate and the down the road effect, it's really something that we respect and we are grateful to have. So folks, thank you for joining us today. I see our hour is up. I will tell you that we are taking next week off for Lunch and Learn. We will not be having, which I can't believe our next week is September. How did that happen, right? Am I jumping ahead or am I right? I think I'm right. But I will also invite you to keep an eye out for Family Partners has some real exciting stuff on tap for September. So we are rolling out some new programs that will include more parent groups on Monday nights. We're going to do 2 in English and 2 in Spanish. And we will continue our Lunch and Learn series, having it once a month in Spanish. And our, I'm thinking we have some changes in our support groups too, that we're adding a mom's group and hopefully a study buddy group for our youth in schools. So good things are happening here as well. Ben, we are happy to be spending time with you today, and we look forward to continuing our work together as partners and supporting families and children in our community. So everybody stay safe, and we will see you soon.
Thanks, Holly.
Ben, thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. See you soon.
Great job, Ben.
Thanks, Sharon. See you soon.